Touching the Essence. 6 Lectures on Buddhism. By Bhikkhu Dhammapala. Henry Van Zeest. Buddhist Publication Society. Kandy, Sri Lanka. The Wheel Publication No. 132/133/134. ISSN 00497541. First edition, 1944, YMBA, Colombo. Second edition, 1969. Third edition, 1986. First 2 editions published under the title, Broadcasts on Buddhism. BPS Online Edition. Copyright, 2008. Digital transcription source, BPS Transcription Project. For free distribution. This work may be republished, reformatted, reprinted, and redistributed in any medium. However, any such republication and redistribution is to be made available to the public on a free and unrestricted basis. And translations and other derivative works are to be clearly marked as such. From the foreword to the first edition. The nature of the radio lectures delivered by me was such that a more careful study of them was thought to be useful not only for the many who listened in at the time, but especially for all who were not in the same position. The lectures, which form a series, touch upon the most essential parts of the Buddha's teaching, the 4 Noble Truths. The 3 characteristics of anicca, dukkha, and anatta, the doctrine of karma, the paticca samuppada, and the deliverance of nibbana. The second part of the lecture on soullessness, being of a more polemic nature, could not be broadcast for obvious reasons, but was delivered at the YMBA. Colombo, the original publishers of this series, under the caption, Can the Soul Idea be Vindicated? The many questions that followed this and similar lectures are a proof of the great interest taken in Buddhism by the intellectual classes. If only the norm is presented to them in a normal way which will satisfy their hunger for truth. May this publication bring about, if not satisfaction, at least a whetting of their appetite. Bhikkhu Dhammapala. Udawat Temple, Kandy. March 15, 2487, 1944. The Evolution of Truth. Aparidajasam amatasadvara. Yesodavanto pamungkantas sadam. Open are the doors to the deathless state. You that have ears, send forth true faith. Dhammakappavattana sutta. With those solemn words the Buddha declared his intention to preach his noble teaching, deep as a lake, hard to perceive, difficult to grasp, tranquil, sublime, beyond sophistry, abstruse, comprehensible, only, by the wise. Mn 26. After having attained that unsurpassable supreme enlightenment, while the Master was seated at the foot of the goatherd's banyan tree at Uravela, he hesitated, wondering whether it would be of any use to make his newly found truth known to the world. For to mankind devoted to, intent on, and delighting in its attachments, it is hard to understand this condition of things. Their causal connection, their dependent origination, the cessation of all conditioned things, the rejection of every basis of rebirth, the waste of craving, dispassionateness, cessation, deliverance, MV 5. But then also the thought came to him that there would be beings only slightly covered with the dust of worldliness, who not hearing the norm would go to ruin, but hearing it might become knowers of the truth. It was for the sake of those few that the Lord Buddha established at Benares in the Deer Park at Isapatana his teaching supreme, which cannot be overthrown either by monk or priest, by God or devil, or by anyone in the world. Mn 141. It is in this first discourse that the Lord Buddha points out that middle path which alone can lead to deliverance by the avoidance of both extremes. Now, after more than 2,500 years, that same discourse is still applicable, word for word. Because only a few have understood and seen, whose ears and eyes were only slightly covered with the dust of ignorance and lust. The doors to the deathless are opened wide still for everyone who cares to see. But also the 2 extremes are there, more attractive than ever. One extreme is being intent upon luxurious living in sensuous pleasures, which is despicable, vulgar, ordinary, base, leading to no good. It is the extreme of materialism, which sees but one origin, matter, and which strives but for one end, material well-being. The other extreme is being intent upon self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, leading to no good. It is the extreme of idealism, which sees but one reality, that of thought, and strives but for one end, the liberation of that thinking self. It was again at the end of the last century that scientific materialism and idealistic monism confronted one another as two independent modes of thought. Theoretically opposed like two extremes, they practically converge both in their starting point and in their goal. Self is their beginning and satisfaction is their end. There is very little difference between the materialists, condemned by the Lord Buddha, the Epicureans of 300 BC denying an external agency as the cause of matter and hence concluding that the highest good was pleasure, and the later materialists like Hobbes, or the positivists like Comte and Stuart Mill, holding that only the sensuous can be an object of knowledge. Though cautious thinkers have abandoned the attempt to explain the entire universe in terms of matter and motion, though the frank materialism of Moleschott, 1852, relegating all the phenomena of life and mind to the changes of matter, is dead to all appearances, yet this scientific thinking had deep repercussions, the effects of which will long still be felt. As soon as science became applied, human craving monopolized it for the sake of its own satisfaction. Inventions have been utilized for the increase of comfort. But increase of comfort has only led to desire for still more. And the desire for more has led and will always lead to conflict and conquest. Over-civilization has brought us to a point where the work of getting food is so strenuous that we lose our appetite for food in the process of getting it. Lin Yutang. Life has become unnatural because it has become mechanized. Man is reduced to the position of a cogwheel in a machine. Like a cogwheel is moved on and on by other, sometimes smaller, wheels, and thus by turning round and round merely passes on that movement to the next. Thus man, to find his place in society, must move on with society, and in his whirling round gets hold also of others, whom he drags along with him in the vortex of materialism. Surely, that is despicable, vulgar, ordinary, base, leading to no good. The other extreme is idealism, which expresses itself in different ways. Yet at bottom they are outgrowths from one root self. Fichte in his subjective idealism held that it is the I alone who exists. All the rest is a modification of my mind. Schelling and Berkeley tell us in their objective idealism that all, including the I, are mere manifestations of the Absolute. Finally, Hegel informs us in his absolute idealism that only the relation between subject and object is real. Has all this anything to do with the extreme against which the Buddha warned us when showing his middle path? Addiction to self-mortification is merely the practical side of the speculation of idealism. In idealism the self is sublimated, with the natural consequence that the self must be liberated from matter. Soul must be delivered from the bonds of the body. The passions of the body must be subdued even by force. Body becomes the eternal enemy of the spirit, which can only be overcome by prayer and fasting. MT 17:21. This kind of idealism will easily lead to pretension, simulation, deceit, hypocrisy. It is much more dangerous than materialism, for materialism may make a man bad and that is the end of it. But idealism will sublimate the evil and call it good. Egoism becomes an eternal soul, killing becomes justice. Nations are suppressed for the sake of freedom, and God in heaven is thanked for a victory here on earth. Thus idealism becomes fanaticism. Surely, that is painful, ignoble, leading to no good. Between the two, not as a meeting place, not as a compromise of the two extremes of materialistic self-indulgence and idealistic self-denial, but avoiding both, the Blessed One has found the middle path. A path not of mediocrity, but of the highest truth and attainment, giving knowledge and wisdom, not in the wavering of speculation. Not in the excitement of discussion, but in tranquility of mind and penetrative insight, leading to enlightenment and deliverance. Enlightenment with regard to the real nature of things, deliverance from all suffering and its cause. Thus the Noble Eightfold Path, though a path of earnest striving, unremitting endeavor, and perseverance till the end, can only be entered upon by right understanding of the truth. With this we arrive again at the old question, which remained unanswered 1900 years ago: what is truth? John 18:38. Truth is usually defined as the correspondence between the intellect and the object. The intellect, however, being the act of understanding, can increase. But increase and growth involve change. Thus even truth is subject to change. This is called subjective truth. Of a purely objective truth we can know nothing, because any experience of it would make it subjective. Truth, therefore, is not something existing in itself, but is a mental experience. Now, that experience will not be the same in all. No one expects a child of 4 to have the same religious notions as a college student. And an adult's experience will be quite different again. There is growth in truth, and for that very reason it cannot be proved, but only be experienced. Proved can only be that which is static, has the nature of an entity. Therefore, to understand that truth is a process, that truth is actuality, that is right understanding. And what is actual? That all component things are sorrow-fraught. This is the first noble truth. Birth is called suffering, because becoming itself is the manifestation of the aggregates, the condition sine qua non of all misery, and also the evil result of past dissatisfaction. Decay is called suffering as the dwindling of vitality. Death is called suffering as the dissolution of the aggregates. Thus the arising as well as the passing away of the aggregates is a source of woe, the first as potential, the later as actual. Sorrow is called suffering which results from loss of relations, wealth, health, virtue, or right understanding. Lamentation is the suffering that finds expression in weeping and crying. Pain is the suffering of bodily discomfort. Grief is the suffering of mental disagreement. Despair is the suffering of worry and mental unrest. To be associated with things one dislikes, to be separated from things one likes, not to get what one wishes, that also is suffering. This together with the last two, viz. Grief and despair, represent the mental characteristic of suffering. Finally and summarily, the 5 aggregates of clinging, pancupadana, are suffering. By which in one word are indicated the root and cause of all suffering, namely clinging, upadana. This is the second noble truth. The source of all suffering is attachment, craving, clinging. This craving takes one of 3 forms: craving for sense pleasures, craving for permanent existence or eternalism, craving for no more existence or annihilationism. The truth of this statement will at once become clear when it is considered, and this is the third noble truth, that with the utter cessation of craving also suffering will come to an end. 4. He who has no desires is always content. Contentment cannot be obtained in any other way, for desires are unsatisfiable. Likened unto a bare bone with which a dog cannot still its hunger, decaying flesh which is poisonous. A torch of straw borne against the wind which thus burns the hand of the bearer, borrowed goods which cannot be kept in possession. Is it pessimism to consider pleasures as suffering? No, it is actuality. But to consider the satisfaction of the senses as real pleasure, that is sheer folly. In order to cure that folly, the fact of suffering is raised to the rank of a noble truth. For folly can only be cured by wisdom. This shows again how Buddhist ethics or moral principles, like everything else in Buddhism, are based on a foundation quite different from morality in other religions. Mental development is exactly what is needed for the development of morality. 4. When religion ceases to be wisdom, it becomes superstition overlaid with reasoning. George Santayana. In other religions good conduct is enough to become a saint. If you have love, you have perfected the law, said St. Paul to the Ephesians. According to later reformers like Luther, faith alone is enough for salvation. But in Buddhism real virtue is impossible, without the foundation of reason. The truth must both be experienced and understood. To experience suffering surely can be done by any being endowed with feeling. That, however, does not prevent a possible return. Understanding therefore is necessary of the real nature of the evil and of its cause. When properly understood, suffering will be seen as an effect of action which must have been evil to produce such a bad effect. When thus understood in connection with action, it becomes living like actuality itself. No longer passive fate but active karma, which means self-responsibility. Action is not finished with action, and it is just that which makes life so terribly actual. At every moment I am reaping the fruit of the past, at every moment I am sowing the seed for the future. Is there then no escape possible, no salvation? There is. And the escape lies along the noble eightfold path, of which right understanding is the first step. Like knowledge of a disease is the chance for a cure, thus understanding the cause and action of suffering is the beginning of deliverance. This understanding should be accompanied by the right intention. It should express itself in word and deed, in practical daily life, in perseverance, and in mind control. Thus should suffering be comprehended, the cause of suffering eradicated, the cessation of suffering realized, and the path leading to the cessation of suffering developed. 4. The knowledge of the truths must be translated into function, if ever the task will be accomplished. This is the noble path that avoids the two extremes of materialism under all its disguises and of idealism with all its false decorations. It is the path of actuality that leads to reality. Only having realized this path with knowledge and insight, the deliverance of mind is steadfast, the last life is reached, rebirth no more waits. And how did the 5 monks to whom this first sermon was preached receive it? What was their reaction? All received it with joy. Yet, only of one it is said that his eyes opened to the truth, and he reflected. Whatsoever is of the nature of arising, that is also subject to cessation. No rapt enthusiasm, no utterance of admiration, but the deep tranquility of a lake without ripple, reflecting the pure light of the sun. Cessation, that is it where the path leads to cessation, not of being. For there is no permanent soul to cease, but cessation of arising, bhavanara equals nibbana. Thus cessation is not a doctrine of rationalized suicide, not of annihilation, and hence it does not lead to asceticism. Only in one sense does the Buddha admit to be an annihilationist, namely in so far as he teaches the annihilation of the passions, of evil inclinations, of craving. To reach this sublime state of perfection there is only one way, the way of renunciation. To renounce is to give up, to let go, to abandon, to discard. And its object is all that has the appearance of being. To be is an affirmation of self, of permanency. Hence all morality which strives to perpetuate self or soul is a subtle kind of selfishness, hence immorality. And the more subtle and sublimated, rationalized, and idealized it is, the more dangerous and the more difficult also to escape from it. Here no rectification of thought will suffice, but only the stilling of thought. No argument can solve this problem. For the more words we use, the greater the chances for misunderstanding. Only one thing is to be done, just ceasing. And in ceasing we will cease. In letting go we shall arrive. In giving up we shall obtain. 4. That which we abandon is the burden of sorrow, that which we discard is the fetter of self. And thus renunciation becomes freedom, relief, deliverance, a foretaste of nirvana. This doctrine of cessation, so characteristic in the Buddha's teaching, is the natural outcome of his discovery that all our suffering is due to our own craving. If craving is suffering, then renunciation must be happiness. In the renunciation of self the clouds of ignorance clear up, for in the light of non-self, anatta, things are seen in their true impermanent nature. In the renunciation of self all distinction between self and others disappears and love becomes truly universal. In the renunciation of self all fear becomes impossible, for fear is the child of delusion and attachment. When pleasures vanish of their own accord they end in keen anguish for the mind. But when relinquished by one's own will they produce infinite happiness proceeding from tranquility, Vairagya. While leading his ascetic life Prince Siddhartha had to leave his 5 companions to find enlightenment all by himself. Only after having purified himself from this attachment he was able to attain what he had sought up to now in vain. Perfect in renunciation. Pure in detachment, with insight and truth, he could return to his former companions without running risks of being defiled by their ignorance and craving. Unaffected by good and bad alike, even as a lotus fair to water gives no lodgment, SN 6. Thus also the mind has to detach itself from the 5 senses of the body. Purified in detachment, enlightened by the truth. The mind can give guidance to the impressions in the five senses, and thus lead experience up to full realization. Then all feelings and perceptions will be conceived as impermanent, then they will lead to dispassion, viraga, to cessation of craving, tanhara. Whose forsaking them one will cling to nothing in the world, and without worry one will attain deliverance for oneself. Then one will know, destroyed is the possibility of rebirth, led is the holy life, done is what had to be done, nothing more for this life. Then truly it may be said, O death! Where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written. Death is swallowed up in victory, 1 Cor 15:55. Not because this corruptible shall have put on incorruptibility, not because this mortal shall have put on immortality, but because no death can sadden, where no more birth occurs. Thus set the Master rolling the wheel of righteousness excellent in the beginning through its foundation on morality. Excellent in the middle through its development of calm and insight, excellent in the end through its termination in Nibbana, Visam 272. Svakhato Bhagavata Dhammo, Sandithako, Akaliko, Ihipasiko, Opanayuko, Pakatam Vedatabo Vinui. Well proclaimed is the teaching of the Blessed One to be realized in this life, yielding fruit immediately. Inviting investigation, leading up to Nibbana, to be attained to by the wise, each one for himself. Syathapi Bhogodamo Nikajitam Va Ukajiya. Patichanam Va Vivariya. Mulhasa Va Magam Asakaya. Antahakare Va Talapajotam Dhariya. Kakumanto Rupani Dakinti. As one with might could set aright what had been overturned. As one has shown what was unknown, what still had to be learned. To men astray he told the way, to truth he gave the key. Into the night he brought a light, so that all men could see. Like these waves of sound spread and roll on and contact you all. May thus the thoughts of loving kindness which permeated these words reach you too and set vibrating in your hearts and minds similar thoughts. So that there may be peace even in war, love amidst hate, freedom from lust in a world of craving, freedom from suffering in an ocean of misery. May all living beings be happy. Touching the Essence. 6 Lectures on Buddhism. By Bhikkhu Dhammapala. Henry Van Zeest. Soullessness. Nedam Mama, Nisa Ham Asmai, Na Mizo Atta. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Anatalak Sutta MVI 6, 38-47. There are some great primary questions that lie at the bottom of every religious system and which form the seed of religious development. Upon the answer to which, depends the nature of any religious philosophy. These questions have been puzzling mankind from time immemorial and they will be troubling him forevermore to come, because though the answers to those weighty questions have been as numerous as there are different religions, they have been unable to satisfy the thinking mind. The reason for the unsatisfactoriness of all these answers and we may safely predict that any future trial to find a new solution to those problems will be equally unsuccessful lies in the fact of the intrinsic impossibility to formulate an answer. Any answer is beside the point because those weighty questions are based upon misunderstanding. All of them begin to assume the existence of the very thing they want to prove. In other words, they beg the question, or in more philosophical terminology they are guilty of the sophism called petitio principii. Some of those questions are, whence am I? Whither do I go? How do I know myself? What happens to me after death? How came I, or life, into this world? How does this world enter into me, into my consciousness? Is the soul the same as the body or not? These and similar questions are sometimes said to be of vital importance. But then only to those who choose to inquire into them. Like children will make a vital problem of the discovery, that a round peg does not go into a square hole. But a person with reason and insight will see at once that it does not fit. Not the peg or the hole, but the child is wrong here. So also not the play of world events, but only those who put such questions are to blame. It will be seen that there should be one question prior to all those inquiries, upon which depends the very possibility of further questioning, namely, is there anything at all which deserves the designation of I? The method followed by the Buddha in solving this question is the most scientific. He does not base his doctrine on logic, for by doing so one ought to presuppose the reality of the thinking subject as standing outside the process of thinking, as a witness or rather as a judge. That which is not logic in reasoning will be either illogical or illogical. Illogical is that which is contrary to logic. Such as faith, belief, acceptance on the authority of someone else without being able even to ascertain the existence of such an authority. Logic in reasoning, as is said, cannot solve the difficulty, because it presupposes that which it is out to prove, hence it becomes a sophism, petitio principii. Only one kind of logic can help here, the logic of events. Only this kind of logic is beyond sophistry, and on this logical basis the Buddha has grounded his teaching of soullessness. The logic of events, of facts, the doctrine of actuality can be understood not by argumentation but by actual analysis. Whatever we know of the body is known in its parts and in its entirety as subject to change. Within 7 years even the smallest particle has been replaced. Composed of the 4 elementary qualities of extension, cohesion, caloricity, and vibration, the ultimate insubstantiality of all so-called solid matter is evident. The relative qualities of hardness and softness, the occupation in and of space, are due to the elementary duality of extension, padhavi. It is the element of cohesion, apo, which makes the many parts adhere intrinsically and to one another, and thus prevents an aimless scattering about or disintegration, thus giving rise to the idea of a body. Caloricity, teju, depends on vibration, veo, for by increased vibration the temperature rises, and when the temperature is lowered, the vibration too is reduced in speed so that gases liquefy, and liquids solidify. Matter being thus reduced to mere qualities and forces which are in a constant state of flux, there certainly no permanent entity can be discerned. Is not there, however, present as something which supports the qualities, which is the possessor of the attributes, which as a substance stands under them all, upholds them all and unites all phenomena. Dimensions, form, place, color, action, even material might change, yet is not there a something which remains unaltered? A table may be round or square, have 3 or 4 legs, have any color and be made of wood or iron, yet for all that, it remains a table. Is there then not a something independent from the phenomena? Independent from all attributes there is not, no substance, no substratum, no entity, not even the idea or concept. For it is impossible even to think of an object without any qualities. The qualities together form the object. The qualities, the phenomena may change, but then the object also changes. A carpenter can make a round table from a square one, still it remains a table. But that is not the entity that has persisted, but only the idea thereof. Namely the concept of an object suitable to lay out meals, to keep smaller articles on, to do writing work, to play games, etc. Yet that idea is dependent on certain conditions, e.g. a flat top. For if that would be removed, even the idea of table cannot remain connected with the remainder. Substance therefore is a mere concept, has no existence except in a worldling's imagination. When science bends more and more to the opinion that all so-called solid matter is merely a form of energy, advocated by scientific materialism, or as some prefer to call it, energism, that is only admitting in different words the ultimate insubstantiality of all so-called solid matter. The view that matter or the body is the real self, or ego entity, must lead to the doctrine of annihilationism, akadadithi, the perishing of that self at the disintegration of the body. The view of the persistence of a self after the breaking up of the body, sasadadithi, will therefore find another more permanent seat for that self, namely the mind. The biologist Haeckel and the chemist Ostwald were the real pioneers of this modern revolt against traditional metaphysics. Yet in the anatta doctrine of the Buddha, a substance-like entity either in matter or mind, underlying and supporting the phenomena, was most categorically denied 25 centuries ago. Yet matter shows more permanency than thought. If thus the body cannot be held to be a permanent entity, still less so can the mind be said to be an everlasting soul or self. Better were it, O monks, said the Lord Buddha, s. 294, that the untrained average man should conceive this body composed of the four primary elementary qualities as soul, rather than the mind. And why? The body is seen to persist for a year or two, for a generation or even for 100 years, while that which is called consciousness, that is mind, that is intelligence, arises as one thing, ceases as another, both by night and by day. Feelings, Vedana, are of three kinds, pleasant, unpleasant or neutral. Now feeling is mental, for if contact is not mentally perceived, no concept of feeling will be formed. Can this mental action of sensation be said to be the self? Or is, sana, the perception of this sensation the self? But then if a pleasant sensation makes place for an unpleasant feeling, one would have to admit that the self has changed. There is, however, an experience which gives the impression that there is something which remains the same even though sensations, impressions, perceptions, concepts change. That remaining, unchanging entity is called the soul. Now it is clearly not our duty to disprove any statement which is made without sufficient ground. On him who puts the thesis rests also the burden of the proof. Otherwise, quod gradus asseritur, gradus negator, what is gratuitously asserted, may be gratuitously rejected. A so-called direct proof for the existence of a soul as a permanent entity to be distinguished from changing modes of action is the firm conviction that, though thoughts and actions change, yet the thinker and the doer remain the same. In refutation it must be said that often the most firm and universal conviction cannot prove a fact. For, conviction is feeling, sentiment, emotion, but proof requires reason. The general conviction of many centuries that this earth was the center of the universe, even the ecclesiastical condemnation of Copernican astronomy, for upholding which Galileo had to undergo dire penalties and Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake, could never change the fact that this earth is a minor planet turning round the sun, which is only a star not of the first brilliancy. Conviction is no proof. But even if we let this pass for argument's sake, we cannot admit that the thinker and doer remain the same. For it is exactly by thoughts that we change our mind, by actions that we change our habits. If that change does not always come all of a sudden and for that reason is less conspicuous, yet the change is not less real for that. Actions cannot be separated from the doer, cannot exist purely as such. There cannot be walking without a body that walks. If therefore the action changes, the so-called actor must change at the same instant. Thus the I is identified with the action. It is only that I, which can walk and sit and think, and eat, and sleep. But that I is not a permanent, unchanging entity. It is identified with the action, is the action itself, and thus changes with the action. I cannot stay at home, while I go out for a walk. It is the conventional language which has spoilt the purity of conception. Though in some cases even the language has remained pure enough, as e.g. in the intransitive form of impersonal verbs, e.g. it rains. Who rains? What rains? Simply, it rains, meaning rain rains. Likewise the concept should not be, I think, but thought thinks. The fact that conventional language uses the terms I and mine may be advanced in support of the human conviction. But that does not make that conviction any truer than our way of speaking of sunrise and sunset. The individual, conventionally called I or self, is a mass of physical and psychical elements without a soul behind them. Without a soul inherent in them, the elements themselves being a mere flux, Santana, a continuity of changes without identity. The Sankhyas too believed in constant change, but a change of the same substratum, eternal matter. The assemblage of impermanent elements, however, does not require a permanent entity to keep them together. The very presence of an unchanging substance would prevent any change in the phenomena dependent on it. In postulating a mythical, permanent, unchanging entity, as the possessor of changing qualities, one merely assumes that the existence of which had to be proved. A single moment of existence has no qualities, but it is those qualities. Matter does not have extension, cohesion, temperature, vibration, but it merely is all that, and without that it is not. Mind, likewise, is not an entity, but a function. Consciousness is thought, and it arises when certain conditions are present: the object, the sense organ, the proper attention. Thus a thought arises not as the action of a thinking subject, but conditioned by, originating from, dependent on other states. And as such it will be again the condition to, the origin of, the raison d'etre of further states and ceasing passing on its movement, thus giving the impulse to new arising. Mind arises from a cause, and without assignable conditions consciousness does not come about. MN 8. Then the Lord Buddha further explains in the Mahatanhasankaya Sutta, that consciousness is conditioned by the objects, i.e., thought arises in dependence on objects presented to the sense organs. If the object is a visible shape and is presented to the eye, then dependent on those conditions, a thought may arise which is called in this case eye consciousness. As fire derives its name, wood fire, grass fire, from the fuel applied. Without fuel, however, no fire; without objects and organs, no thought can arise. Becoming is according to the stimulus, lit food, and when that stimulus ceases, that which has become also ceases. Void is this of self, or aught of the nature soul. MN 43, Mahavadala Sutta. The teaching of anatta does not proclaim that there is no individuality, no self, but only that there is no permanent individuality, no unchanging self. Personality or individuality is according to Buddhism not an entity, but a process of arising and passing away, a process of nutrition, a process of combustion, a process of grasping. This individuality has no permanent existence, as a wave in the ocean is only existent as a process, and in rolling on makes itself, and destroys itself. Yet the individuality of consciousness, though not a permanent entity or soul, is neither a merely physical process. It is a process of grasping. Like fire can only burn as long as it lays hold of new fuel. Thus the process of individuality is a constant arising, an ever-renewed laying hold of the objects of its craving, a process of grasping. It is craving which causes the friction between sense objects and sense organs. And from that friction leaps up the flame of new karma which in ignorance will not be extinguished, but in grasping lays hold of fresh material, thus keeping alive the process of burning. All is a burning, O monks. The eye is burning, form is burning, eye consciousness is burning, eye contact is burning. And whatever feeling arises dependent on that contact, that also is burning, burning with the fire of lust, the fire of hate, the fire of delusion. Mahavagga, 120.2. As long as that fire is kept aflame, there will be the delusion of self. There will be the craving to perpetuate that individual self, so that it becomes a something rather than a function, an entity rather than a condition, a soul which sharply separates man from the animals, which have no souls worth saving. Thus in the ultimate sense this deluded affirmation of self as a permanent soul, is craving which says, "This is mine, etam mama," it is pride which says, "This am I, so aham asmi," it is the erroneous view which says, "This is my soul, miso atta." The error is rooted in craving and pride, craving for happiness and bliss, pride which cannot acknowledge defeat. Where the wrong view of an everlasting soul is thus connected with craving for permanency and bliss, there the teaching of soullessness must necessarily follow from the teaching that all things are impermanent and unsatisfactory. If there were in this body a soul, if feeling or perception, mental differentiations or consciousness were the real self, then the body would not be subject to ill, the mind would not be subject to distress, for if they were the real self, they would be in a position to order. Let this be so, let this not be so. If then the body and the mind are impermanent and for that reason sorrow-fraught, one is not justified in thinking, "This is mine, this am I, this is my soul." Few there are in the world who identify this perishable body with a permanent entity or soul. On the other hand, there are many who maintain that the mind or one of its functions, like sensation, perception, mental differentiations, or consciousness, are identical with an individual, permanent soul. Or that those functions possess such a soul entity, or that they contain in their action such a permanent self, or, finally, that they are contained by or in a soul. There are many who even now try to prove the existence of a soul. It is maintained by them that the changing mind and character are supported by an unchanging soul. This supposed soul escapes all observation, even though there may be some awareness of thought and action. A direct proof of this existence of a permanent soul is universally admitted to be impossible. It cannot be known directly in itself. What, however, cannot be known directly in itself, might be known sometimes indirectly from its working. If an effect can be observed, we may legitimately conclude to the existence of a cause. And the nature of the effect proves to some extent the nature of the cause. There is no need to put one's finger in the fire to find out whether the fire is hot. One can readily conclude to the heat of the fire, if the temperature of the water increases, while being placed over the fire. Similarly, a permanent soul, if it would be existent, must produce effects according to its nature. Now a being, in order to be permanent, as the soul is supposed to be, cannot be material, because matter is composed, and what is composed is also decomposable, that is impermanent. Hence the permanent soul should be immaterial. This is fully admitted even by the strongest adherers to the soul theory. Indeed, they claim the soul to be spiritual. But if the soul is immaterial, its working must be immaterial also, and its existence and functioning should be independent from matter. Around this turns the whole argument in favor of or in disproof of the existence of a soul. This independence from matter is attempted to be proved in various ways. We shall consider and refute them one by one. The first alleged proof is taken from external evidence, namely the opinion of all men. If all people agree upon one point, it is said to be the voice of nature, which cannot err. It is said that all people at all times were convinced of a continued existence after death. Now this argument loses its very foundation, because not all men believe in a soul. 1/6 of the world's population is Buddhist and denies the existence and the very idea of a soul. Further, there are millions of atheists and scientific men who have lost all faith in God, soul, and religion. Who have turned completely materialists. Who, even if some of them accept the existence of a substance underlying the phenomena, will consider this to be of a purely material substance dependent on, and perishing together with, the co-existing form. Further still, even the majority of the so-called believers are so only in name. For they contradict their faith by their deeds whenever they commit a mortal sin, thus condemning their souls to eternal damnation for the sake of a short-lived satisfaction, which they certainly never would do, if they really believed in an eternal soul. Thus there remains only a very small minority who really and actually believe in their soul. And they can certainly not claim to echo the voice of nature. For their conviction is not even a natural growth of mental development, but rather a remnant of the childish submission in their youth to the dogmatic interpretation by ecclesiastical authorities. This kind of blind faith, which, enforced upon the child, remains sometimes a habit in uneducated adults, is in reality the crudest form of religion, hardly to be distinguished in degree from the superstitious practices of primitive tribes. But, moreover, what is this voice of nature? It is nothing else but the collection of individual opinions. As a nation is the collection of persons, born and living in the same country. If one individual can err, so can 2 or 3, or 1,000, or 1,000,000, and even all. The fact of general opinion, even of the whole human race, should never be overestimated. In the past we have seen how the strongest convictions have finally crumbled so that they now seem ridiculous to us. Yet in their days people have made even the sacrifice of their lives for convictions. Generally disbelieved then, but now equally generally accepted. Which is only another way or saying that general opinion has changed. Only 400 years ago the mass of civilized humanity labored under the delusion that the sun goes daily round the earth. That this earth forms the center of the universe. Copernicus stood practically alone, opposing not only what was then said to be common sense, but also divine revelation and the authority of the Bible. Galileo was jailed and by threat of torture compelled to disavow his former opinions. Because his telescope contradicted the Bible. Because Giordano Bruno dared to draw some inferences from the Copernican theory contrary to the scholastic philosophy of the Church based on Aristotle. He was excommunicated and handed over to the secular authorities with a recommendation of a punishment as merciful as possible and without shedding of blood. The atrocious formula for burning alive. He perished in the flames, turning his eyes away from the crucifix that was held up to him. The victim of theological stupidity and self-applauding intolerance, the martyr for freedom of thought. It was and still is the common daily testimony of the sense of sight of every being that the sun does move round the earth. And yet, that sense of sight, that common sense, that general opinion, that divine revelation, that biblical authority, were clearly mistaken and false. The same happens even nowadays and might happen ever and ever again. What was only yesterday proved by science and tested in practice, is overthrown today by some newer theories equally proved and tested and universally accepted. Till tomorrow some more advanced theories are brought forward, explaining the same facts quite differently, but more logically and more according to the truth. Does truth change? If by truth is meant, as it is defined in philosophy, the harmony between consciousness and the known object, then truth will change with any increase or decrease of knowledge. Then there will be degrees of truth, of objective truth in which the object becomes better known, or of subjective truth in which knowledge becomes clearer. If truth, on the other hand, is taken in itself, it must be said to have no existence at all. For if an object is not related to any knowing mind, in which would then exist its truth? Moreover, we usually call a thing true, if it corresponds with the idea we have formed of it. But our ideas themselves, according to which we judge the truth of things, are formed from impressions of those self-same objects. Thus it will be seen that a general or even universal agreement of opinion is no sign of proof of the truth. To say then that the voice of nature, if there would be any such thing, cannot err is neither induction, i.e., a conclusion from individual experience to a general truth or principle, nor deduction, i.e., an application of a universal characteristic to individual cases. It is merely bad logic based on sentiment rather than on reason. In this way we have disposed of external evidence in favor of the soul idea in two ways. Namely, in so far as we have shown that the existence of a soul is not the universal opinion, and even if it were so, it would prove nothing. It may be true that all people at all times believe in existence after death. Even we Buddhists accept this doctrine. But existence after death does not involve a permanent existence after death, nor the existence of a permanent soul. Even the Hindus, who believe in transmigration of soul as opposed to the soulless rebirth in Buddhism, do not really believe in individual, permanent souls. For according to Vedanta, the soul after transmigration through many lives in samsara will be reunited, reabsorbed in Brahman from where it was emanated in the beginning of its wandering. There its individual existence will have come to an end. External evidence thus having failed, we come to a whole series of arguments alleged to be proofs from internal evidence. Internal evidence means evidence that manifests itself not directly in its existence, but only indirectly through the manifestation of action. Thus, e.g., when a car tire goes flat, we may safely conclude that there must be a hole somewhere in the tube, even if we cannot discern it with the eye. For, if there were no hole, the air could not have escaped. Similarly, from the working of the intellect we may draw some conclusions with regard to the nature of the intellect. Everything is received according to the nature of the receiver. Water, e.g., takes the shape of the glass tumbler in which it is contained. Colors can only be perceived by the sense organ of sight. Sound only by the ear, etc. Now the mind is said to have universal or general ideas. Though John Locke, the English philosopher of the 17th century, in his Doctrine of Ideas, maintained that universal ideas stand for individual objects that are real in the context of experience. This would be a proof for the materiality of universals rather than for anything else. There will be, however, very few supporters of the soul theory if any, to support this opinion, for if universal ideas stand for individual objects, they would cease to be universal. And that is exactly our point of view. Berkeley, though a bishop of the Church of England, and an idealist in the fullest sense, thought rightly that all ideas are particular. Things or objects as presented are individual. They are given together with the relations, each of which may be described by concrete reference to the presented object or event. There is no such thing as shape apart from objects possessing shape, nor color apart from things having color, or any idea of motion except as bodies moving, principles of human knowledge. The idea of a triangle is dependent on the knowledge of various types of triangle. The idea of color has no reality, cannot be thought of except as red, or blue, or white, etc. Universality has no meaning apart from the relationship of particulars. An idea is general only in so far as it stands for particulars of the same kind. We speak about humanity. It is true this idea maintains even though individuals die and are born, even though after 100 years the whole human race has been renewed. But still the idea is only possible as a collective noun through knowledge of individuals. Thus the idea is based on, and derived from, material experience and therefore cannot be said to be immaterial. A proof that the so-called universal or general ideas are based on a material foundation can be obtained from the fact that, if the material experience is insufficient or wrong, the so-called general ideas will suffer from the same deficiency. The first Europeans, e.g., who landed in Africa, created a panic by their mere appearance, because they were not considered to be human beings. Clearly the idea of a particular color had crept into the idea of a human. Only when experience grows, ideas become enlarged, so that the most general or universal idea is dependent on the largest amount of individual, particular experience which is always material. If therefore universal ideas do not contain anything immaterial, the intellect itself cannot be said to be immaterial. Thus even if there would be a soul, we might conclude from its material action that it too would be material. But material is composed, hence it is also decomposable or impermanent. A second refutation can be drawn up from the major premise that everything is received according to the nature of the receiver. Now it is beyond doubt, and everyone will have to admit it for himself, that the mind has many times very material and materialistic ideas, thoughts of lust and hate, of profit and comfort. Those thoughts must come from a material source. Now, if the soul is said to be that source, then it is a very material soul, indeed. Decomposable also, because material, and hence impermanent, and no soul at all. Another argument from internal evidence to prove the existence of an immaterial, permanent soul is taken from the fact that the mind seems to have immaterial concepts like unity, truth, virtue, justice. Those concepts, however, are not truly immaterial, as they have been derived from material experience. The idea of unity arose only when, after counting for a long time with beads or beans, we were able to substitute units for those objects. Unity is nothing but uniformity from a certain point of view, while the differences are intentionally overlooked. Even unity and order in nature, on which science has built its laws and axioms, have no real existence, but are based on experiment and observation. Hence thoroughly material, and can be overturned by new observation and experiment. Even 1,000 scientific experiments do not definitely prove a fact, and make it a law, but one single experiment can upset the law and prove its invalidity. As physical phenomena do not follow an absolutely rigorous necessity, but permit a contingency, incalculable like chance, so the mind does not follow any fixed law. Though conditioned and influenced, its choice cannot be predicted. Thus the alleged perfect regularity, uniformity, necessity of things is a mental fiction, a proof of the possibility of mental aberration in its lack in actuality rather than of immateriality. Likewise truth, virtue, justice, etc. are only ideas resulting from associating different experiences. They are dependent on education, and that is not even a sign of reason, still less of immateriality. For even a dog can learn to do many things and finally come to understand that putting up his right paw means a piece of cake. Education, which is nothing but mental training, brings ideas together. And once they are associated, the point of connection might become hidden in the subconscious mind. The real connection being forgotten or suppressed, the mind will try to establish an artificial link, which is called rationalization. If ideas like virtue and justice were really immaterial and permanent, they ought to remain the same and unaltered in different times and climes. But the association of ideas depends on acquired learning and cannot be therefore an inherent natural action of a permanent soul. Thus a Christian who keeps 2 wives is guilty of bigamy and considered as very immoral. But a Muslim can be very virtuous in the legal possession of many more than 2. That morality changes is a truism. Not so very long ago slavery was deemed right, encouraged by the state, sanctioned by the church. But that way of thinking has given place to a morality which judges slavery to be wrong, because it assigns higher values to human personality. A few hundred years ago any father had the absolute right of life and death over his own children. Nowadays we have laws even for the prevention of cruelty against animals. The moral laws which prevail here in Kamaloka, do not hold good in Brahmaloka. Thus these few examples show that abstract ideas like virtue, justice, and morality are very much impermanent and can therefore not be the expressions of a permanent soul. But then, the mind can conceive essential ideas, it is said, expressing the intrinsic nature of things. Such as definitions comprising the common genus and the specifying difference. These are said to be unchangeable and can therefore only be conceived by an unchangeable, permanent entity or soul. Definitions are said to originate from Socrates, while Plato built up a system of eternal ideas. But definitions have as little reality about them as a mathematical problem. They may be useful or even necessary for logical distinctions, but they cannot be said to be either permanent or impermanent, because they are mere mental fiction. Definitions, essential ideas, so-called eternal principles are all based on material experience and exist only in particulars. It is the very nature of essence to be particularized. It is true that we try to separate the idea of man from this or that individual. But at once we find it impossible for the essential idea to exist separately, and equally impossible to unite it with the individual, as we do not see any relation. This unnatural and illogical position arises from the mistake that we tried to separate the two. Essence only exists in particulars. Thus they are not unchangeable in this sense that the objects to which they refer and on which they depend, are changeable and impermanent. The particulars are material, so are therefore definitions and essences, abstractions and universals. The last arrow on the bow of internal evidence from the intellectual powers is the reflex idea. In reflection thought becomes the object of thought. And here certainly, say the upholders of the soul idea, is nothing material. According to Buddhism the mind is classed as a sense, the internal sense, and thus we have 2 sources of ideas, sensations which have come through the external sense doors. Eye for sight, ear for sound, nose for odor, tongue for taste and the whole body for touch and sensations furnished by the mind of its own operations, reflections. Thus reflection is the knowledge of perceived sensations. When sensations are material and are perceived in material sense organs, how then can the knowledge thereof become at once immaterial? Reflex ideas are also experienced in animals. They too show to have memory, attachment, and revenge. Yet nobody will maintain that animals have an immortal soul, for never yet has a dog been baptized to save his soul from eternal damnation. But if animals can have reflections without a permanent soul, why should a soul be postulated in the case of humans? There is separate from the intellect another power in man which is the subject of much controversy, and that is the will. The supporters of the soul theory try to make the working of the powers of the will dependent on the soul they imagine. And like for the intellectual powers they claim the will power to be immaterial. Because it strives, they say, not only after material and particular good things, but for the absolute good. This is not true, because the absolute good cannot be known. Would it be known, it would cease to be absolute and become relative. What cannot be known cannot be desired or willed for, and such a general object cannot have any attractive power. No man can love the most beautiful woman in the world without knowing her, though this is still rather material. One always strives for some particular good which is always material. Immaterial objects do not exist. This is a mere phrase containing a contradiction in terms. It is maintained, however, that some will objects are unchangeable, e.g., it is always good to respect one's parents. But if that respect would include even obedience with regard to evil, it would no longer be good, and thus no fitting will object. Whatever is good or bad is only so with respect to its good or bad effect. Kama is only kusala if there is a kusala vipaka. And as the effect or the result is always particular, a concrete instance, the action and volition must be of the same kind. From this follows a last objection, namely the freedom of the will. In inorganic matter we see an absolutely rigid determinism towards a certain end, but in similar circumstances man remains free and master over his actions, which clearly show his superiority over and independence from matter. Thus if the will is free, that is independent, it must be immaterial and then also permanent. The discussion on the freedom of will is usually opened from the wrong perspective. For, whether one accepts the freedom of the will or rejects its independence, in both cases the will is taken as an entity, as something existent, be it free or be it bound. Will, however, can neither be said to be free, nor bound, because it is non-existent. It merely arises whenever there is the possibility of a choice. If there is nothing to choose from, there can be no question of willing. On the other hand, the possibility of choosing shows the presence of two opposites or more. The possibility to choose what is evil shows that the action is conditioned and influenced, and therefore not free. Even if one chooses to do what one knows to be harmful to oneself, there will still be some motives that brought about that choice. E.g., knowing that association with certain people will bring one to excessive drinking and gambling and other actions that bring about financial difficulties, deterioration of health, and the ruin of family happiness, yet one might seek that company because one lacks the moral strength to break with them. To show one's courage, to imagine one's independence, are sufficient subconscious motives to influence and determine one's choice against the better dictates of reason and common sense. Even one's pride might not allow one to go back on a previous decision, even if it is perceived as harmful. If there were no attraction, no inducement, no motive, equilibrium would have been established already and no choice would take place. Thus volition arises only when a choice becomes possible. If there is a choice possible, there will be attraction and repulsion that influence the choice and make it not free. If there is no choice, then, of course, there is no will at all, but determinism and no freedom whatever. When we, therefore, must admit that this inducement and coercion is never absent, we must also conclude that will is never free. As we can only strive for one end which we see and understand as best according to our limited capacities, so we can only choose those means which seem to us the best under given circumstances. The reasons that induce us to choose a certain means may differ in different people according to their understanding. But, though the line we follow may differ, we all follow the line of least resistance. To speak about free will contains really a contradiction, which is carefully avoided in our Buddhist psychology. For free will would indicate the existence of a will prior to, and independent from, a choice, while will, which is but another and milder word for craving, does not exist separately, but only arises in dependence on contact and feeling, phasa pakaya vedana pakaya tanha. Where contact and feeling cease, no craving can arise. This teaching is not the same as the psychological determinism of Leibniz and Herbart, in so far that the doctrine of Kama is not fatalism. Kama is volition, cetana, said the Lord Buddha, but volition itself is based on consciousness that is continually arising and passing. It is this consciousness fettered by craving which is ignorance, but freed from the fetters, say myojana, and defilements, kilsa, it is deliverance or nibbana. Freed from craving there is pure insight, and no more volition, no more kama. Thus our real freedom lies not in the will, but to be without will. Thus we have then disposed of all the so-called proofs in favor of a permanent soul. Some Western scholars in Oriental languages, though not scholars in the teachings expressed therein, yet venture to offer their criticism on this most essential point in the Dhamma. They will explain no self as self in the following way: when the Buddha, speaking of the components of the aggregates of clinging, Pancupatanakandha, said of each separately, "That does not belong to me, that am I not. That is not myself," what else could he mean but that the self or soul exists separate from them? To which we answer, had the Buddha stated simply and directly that there is no permanent ego entity, he would have given the impression of siding with the annihilationists against the eternalists. Well, both schools of thought were wrong, and the Buddha wanted to show to both their wrong. Therefore, without saying that life comes to a complete end at death, which is the teaching of annihilationism, he merely analyzed the so-called being, and whatever he found of matter or of mind, he did not find a soul there. Could he have taught us the doctrine of no self, anatta, more explicitly and more impressively? Whatever there be, that does not belong to me, that am I not, that is not myself, netam mama, nisa ham asmai, na mizo atta. Personality was described by the Bhikkhu Vihara as a bundle of aggregates, thus a stream of successive states without abiding entity. There is then no sound basis for the assertion that the soul is distinct from the body or mind. If, therefore, one maintains that the soul is immortal, one must equally predicate that body and mind are immortal, which is clearly absurd. Human soul cannot be distinct from human life, and human life collapses together with the body, just like animal life and body. What remains? The influence of good or bad deeds, which will cause another life on the same basis of good or bad. There is no soul, there is no self, no permanent I or ego entity. But there is a flux, a process of life, of action and reaction, which rises and falls like the waves of the ocean. Those waves will come to rest, that process will come to a stop, when all desires are stilled, because I is an expression of selfishness, of craving. When craving has gone, no I will be left. If the teaching of the Lord Buddha is rightly said to be beyond sophistry, atakavakara, it is never more so than with regard to the teaching of soullessness, anatta. For, any reasoning, even the purest logic, will presuppose the ego in thinking, as Descartes did, I think therefore I am cogito ergo sum. Soullessness cannot be proved with reason, as darkness cannot be seen by bringing in a light. Darkness can be experienced only when all light is quenched. Likewise, soullessness can only be realized when all selfishness is excluded. When the craving of mine and the pride of I have vanished, then also the error of self, sakyadithi, cannot arise. But when there is no more thought of self, disgust will be felt, leading to dispassion on the path of sainthood. And this detachment will produce the sweet fruit of emancipation with the knowledge of attainment that the possibility of rebirth is extirpated. Lived is the holy life, done is what had to be done, beyond this there is none. The load of life laid low. The precious price is paid. The waves of well and woe of stormy stream are stayed. The direst duties done. A tenfold tiger tamed. The weary war is won. The timeless term obtained. It is significant that after hearing the first discourse of the Buddha, only one of the 5 disciples understood, and even he could only enter the path to holiness. A fuller explanation of the truth was necessary. But after hearing this second discourse, the Anattalakkhana Sutta, all 5 attained the highest perfection of arahatship. Soullessness is indeed a lakkhana, a distinguishing mark, the essential characteristic of the truth. For with self all morality is immorality, but without self good and bad alike are transcended in the pure deliverance of heart and mind. In the freedom from all attachment or lust, from all aversion or hate, from all ignorance or delusion. May the understanding of soullessness grow in us through the practice of unselfishness. May we come unto this darkness which is beyond the light of mere reason, may we without seeing and without knowing, see and know that which is above vision and knowledge. Through the realization that by not seeing and by not knowing we attain true vision and knowledge, Dionysius, the Areopagite. May in the realization of non-self all beings be happy.